In 1981, a space shuttle passed over the Sahara Desert and looked down through the sand. Not at the sand, through it. The instrument was called the Shuttle Imaging Radar, and what it revealed beneath the surface of the largest desert on Earth shook the geological community in a way that the official record has never quite managed to fully absorb. Beneath the rolling dunes and the bare rock plateaus, beneath the landscape that every map and every school textbook has described as one of the most barren and inhospitable environments on the planet, the radar saw water. Not current water, the ghost of water. Ancient channels cut deep into the bedrock, channels so large and so clearly defined that the instrument could trace their paths for hundreds of kilometers across the buried landscape. Channels that had once carried rivers that flowed in the wrong direction. The standard model of African drainage is reasonably straightforward. The great rivers of the continent, the Nile, the Congo, the Niger, the Zambezi, orient themselves according to the logic of continental topography. The Nile runs north to the Mediterranean. The Congo runs west to the Atlantic. Drainage follows elevation, and the elevation of Africa generally slopes in directions that produce rivers running toward the coasts in predictable patterns. This is the version of African hydrology that appears in textbooks and on maps, and in the teaching of every geography course at every level of education worldwide. But the rivers beneath the Sahara do not follow this logic. They run east to west, across nearly the full width of the continent, in a direction that the current topography does not permit, and that the current drainage patterns actively contradict. Rivers 1,000 miles long and more, in some cases approaching 1,200 miles in total length, cutting through the bedrock of the African continent in a direction that makes no sense if you look at the landscape as it exists today. Rivers that apparently flowed not toward the Mediterranean in the north, but laterally in a direction that implies either a radically different topographic arrangement or something even more difficult for the standard model to accommodate. The question that the mainstream geological literature has spent 4 decades not quite answering is this: what kind of world produces rivers like these? If you are willing to consider the answer that the Tartaria framework provides, the one that the academic institutions have not been willing to consider, then what lies beneath the Sahara is not merely a geological curiosity. It is evidence of a civilization that preceded the one we know. A civilization that understood hydraulics at a scale that our own engineering tradition has only recently begun to approach. A civilization that built and maintained river systems across the full breadth of a continent, that managed water on a planetary scale, and that was erased from the historical record so thoroughly that we have spent centuries believing the desert above these ancient waterways was always a desert. It was not always a desert, and the rivers beneath it may not be entirely what the geologists say they are. If this topic is something you want to understand fully, subscribe and turn on notifications before we go further. Everything covered in this video goes deeper than a single viewing, and new material connecting to what you are about to hear is being added regularly. This community is built around questions the standard curriculum does not ask. If those are your questions too, you belong here. The story of the Saharan paleorivers begins with a piece of technology that was not designed to see underground. The Shuttle Imaging Radar, known as SIRA, was carried on the Space Shuttle Columbia in November 1981 as part of a mission to test the capabilities of synthetic aperture radar in a spaceborne context. The Sahara was one of the regions selected for imaging because its clear, dry air and minimal vegetation made it a theoretically ideal environment for radar mapping of surface geology. What no one anticipated was that the dry conditions that made the Sahara attractive for surface radar imaging would also allow the radar signal to penetrate beneath the surface. Radar energy at certain wavelengths is absorbed by moisture. In environments with significant soil moisture, the signal reflects from the surface. But in the hyper-arid conditions of the Central Sahara, where the sand and rock are essentially completely desiccated, the radar signal passed through the upper layers of material and reflected from denser structures below. Specifically, It reflected from the surfaces of buried rock formations, including the walls and floors of ancient drainage channels that had been buried under meters of wind-blown sand and geological deposition over thousands of years. The images produced by this accidental subsurface view were extraordinary. They showed, with unmistakable clarity, a network of ancient channels crossing the eastern Sahara in the region of what is now southern Egypt, northeastern Sudan, and northwestern Libya. The channels were large. The largest of the mapped channels was estimated to have been between 5 and 8 kilometers wide at its maximum extent, comparable in scale to modern large rivers like the Rhine or the Missouri. The depth of incision into the underlying bedrock indicated flow volumes that were orders of magnitude greater than any river currently present in the region. The discovery was published in Science magazine in 1982 by John Macaulay and colleagues under the title Subsurface Valleys and Geoarchaeology of the Eastern Sahara, revealed by shuttle radar. It attracted significant attention at the time, including coverage in major publications around the world. Archaeological investigations of the areas identified by the radar subsequently found stone tools, lake sediments, fossil bones, and other evidence of past habitation, and dramatically wetter conditions along the mapped channel systems. And then, to a significant degree, the wider conversation stopped. The discovery was absorbed into the geological literature as a confirmed instance of paleo-drainage. Ancient drainage channels formed during wetter climatic periods that had subsequently been buried by aeolian sediment deposition as the climate dried. The discussion moved on to questions of when the channels were active, what the climatic conditions were at the time, and how the drainage patterns related to the broader question of African paleoclimate. What did not happen was a serious examination of the directional anomaly, because the rivers flow the wrong way. The Eastern Sahara, where the first major radar discoveries were made, drains in the current landscape primarily toward the north. The Nile, which runs through the eastern margin of the region, is the dominant drainage feature, and its watershed captures the majority of whatever precipitation falls in the region. The general slope of the terrain pushes water toward the north and toward the east, but the buried channels identified by the radar run west. And in some interpretations of the data, extending the mapped channel systems using both radar imagery and ground-penetrating investigations, the channels appear to connect across the full breadth of the Sahara to reach what would have been Atlantic drainage. A river system of this scale, flowing from east to west across nearly 4,000 kilometers of the African continent, would represent one of the largest river systems in Earth's geological history. The mainstream explanation for the directional anomaly is tectonic. The argument is that the topography of the African continent has changed significantly over geological time. What is now high ground was once low ground, and what is now low ground was once higher. Continental tilting, faulting, and the formation of major geological features, like the East African Rift System, have altered the drainage patterns of the continent over millions of years, and rivers that once flowed west may have had their drainage captured by the developing Nile system and redirected. This is a coherent geological argument, but it does not address the scale. 1,200 miles is a very specific number. It appears in the scientific literature as an approximate figure for the length of the longest individual channel systems that have been traced in the Saharan paleo-drainage network. To put that number in context, the Rhine River, one of the major rivers of Europe, is approximately 800 miles long from its source in the Swiss Alps to its mouth at the North Sea. A 1,200-mile river beneath the Sahara would be among the largest rivers on Earth, past or present, and there is not one such system. There are several. The work done since the initial 1982 discovery has mapped multiple major paleo-river systems across the Saharan region. The Wadi Howa system in Sudan and Chad has been traced for hundreds of kilometers. The Kufra basin in Libya has been identified as a major collection area for ancient drainage. Channel systems in northern Niger, in Mali, and in Mauritania suggest a continuous network of rivers that once covered the entire breadth of the Saharan region. And in every case where the directional data is clear enough to analyze, the dominant flow direction is west, in patterns that do not align with the current topography. The Green Sahara periods, known technically as African humid periods, are real. This is not disputed by any serious scientific authority. There have been multiple periods in the geological past during which the Sahara was dramatically wetter than it is today. The most recent of these, sometimes called the Holocene African humid period, or colloquially the Green Sahara, lasted from approximately 11,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago, a span of 6,000 years during which the region received significantly more rainfall, supported large lakes and river systems, and was inhabited by people and animals that today would find the Sahara uninhabitable. The cave paintings of Tassili Niger in Algeria, some of the most significant bodies of prehistoric rock art in the world, depict cattle and hippopotamuses and swimming human figures in a landscape that is now absolute desert. They were made by people who were not imagining a wetter world. They were documenting the one they lived in. Archaeological sites from this period are distributed across the Sahara in patterns that track the ancient waterways. Lakeside settlements, fishing communities, cattle herding cultures, complex social groups with sophisticated material cultures have all been identified in locations that are today hundreds of kilometers from any water source. The human population of the Saharan region during the Green Sahara period appears to have been substantial, widely distributed, and in regular contact across the full breadth of what later became desert. And this is where the mainstream account and the Tartaria framework begin to diverge in a way that matters. The mainstream account treats the Green Sahara as a natural climatic phenomenon driven by orbital forcing, specifically by the periodic variation in Earth's axial tilt known as the Milankovitch cycle. During certain orbital configurations, the northern hemisphere receives more summer solar radiation, which intensifies the West African monsoon and pushes rainfall further north into what is now the Sahara. In this account, the people who lived alongside the Green Sahara rivers were Neolithic and Chalcolithic peoples with subsistence economies based on cattle herding and fishing, without the organizational complexity to have significantly modified the hydrological landscape. The Tartaria framework asks a different set of questions. It begins with the observation that the scale and the regularity of the Saharan paleoriver systems are not what you would expect from purely natural drainage. Natural rivers develop according to established relationships between channel length and drainage basin area, and they exhibit the characteristic branching patterns of dendritic drainage networks. The patterns visible in the Saharan paleo drainage, particularly in the more recently analysed sections using ground-penetrating radar and enhanced satellite imagery, show regularities that are difficult to account for as purely natural phenomena. Specifically, the channel geometry in certain sections shows evidence of what appear to be artificially maintained cross-sections. Natural rivers scour their channels to a shape that reflects the balance between the erosive force of the water and the resistance of the underlying material. That shape is irregular, responding to local variations in rock hardness, sediment load, and flow velocity. Artificially maintained channels, whether ancient irrigation canals or modern flood control structures, show different geometric properties. They tend to be more regular in cross-section, more consistent in slope, and more precisely directed than natural drainage. The Tartaria interpretation of the Saharan paleorivers is that at least some of these channel systems were not entirely natural. They were managed. They were, in the terminology of hydraulic civilization history, improved. The people who lived along them during the Green Sahara period, or the civilization that preceded and in some accounts created the conditions of the Green Sahara period, maintained and possibly extended the channel network in ways that increased its efficiency and its reach. This is not a claim without precedent in the archaeological literature. The evidence for extensive hydraulic management by ancient civilizations is substantial. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, In pre-Columbian Mesoamerica and South America, the major ancient civilizations of the world are all characterized by sophisticated water management. The ability to control water, to store it, to direct it, to distribute it across agricultural landscapes is not a feature of advanced civilization. It is, in many accounts, the precondition for it. What the Tartaria framework proposes is that the hydraulic management visible in the well-documented ancient civilizations is itself derived from an older tradition, a tradition that was global in extent, that preceded the civilizations we know, and that left its traces in the landscape in forms that we have consistently misidentified as natural features. The Tartarian civilization, as it is described in the alternative history literature that uses this framework, was a global hydraulic civilization. It managed water at a continental scale. Its infrastructure included not only the river systems that we can now image from orbit with ground-penetrating radar, but the reservoirs, the distribution networks, the agricultural systems, and the urban settlements that a civilization managing water at that scale would require. And it was destroyed, or dramatically reduced, or deliberately obscured in a catastrophic event or series of events that has been variously identified as a flood, a war, a reset of human civilization imposed by an elite that survived the catastrophe, while the majority of the population did not. The east to west direction of the Saharan paleorivers is significant in the Tartaria framework precisely because it is anomalous. Natural drainage follows topography. Managed drainage follows intention. The intention implied by a river system that flows east to west across nearly the full breadth of the African continent is an intention that is difficult to explain in terms of any local engineering project. It is the kind of intention that implies planning at a scale that challenges the standard narrative of what pre-dynastic human civilization was capable of. There is a body of cartographic evidence that the alternative history community has assembled and that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives from mainstream historians. The Piri Reis map of 1513, the Orontius Phineas map of 1531, and various other early modern cartographic works are cited in the Tartaria literature as evidence that the cartographers of the 16th and 17th centuries had access to source maps that contained information about the Earth's geography that should not have been available to them according to the standard historical account. What is less often noted in the popular discussion of these cartographic anomalies is that several of the disputed early modern maps also show river systems in the Saharan and sub-Saharan regions that do not correspond to the current drainage of those areas. The Waldseemüller map of 1507, generally considered among the most important cartographic documents of the age of exploration, shows river courses in interior Africa that have no correspondence to the current hydrological map, but that bear a suggestive resemblance to some of the paleochannel systems identified by radar imagery 5 centuries later. This could be coincidence, but it might be evidence that the cartographic traditions of the early modern period drew on source material that was itself drawn from direct knowledge of a landscape that no longer existed. Knowledge of the Green Sahara river systems, knowledge that survived the drying of the Sahara in documents that were eventually incorporated, imperfectly and through multiple translations, into the cartographic tradition of the 15th and 16th centuries. If such source documents existed, they were the product of the civilization that managed the Saharan rivers, the civilization whose traces are in the landscape beneath the sand. Across the Saharan and sub-Saharan region, there are structures and sites that do not fit comfortably within the standard narrative of the region's human history. The megalithic structures of Nabta Playa in southern Egypt, dated to approximately 7,000 years ago, constitute what appears to be a sophisticated astronomical and ceremonial complex constructed by a cattle-herding culture. The precision of the astronomical alignments at Nabta Playa exceeds what would be expected of a simple pastoral society. The organizational capacity required to construct and maintain such a site implies a level of social complexity and specialized knowledge that the standard archaeological account of the region's prehistory does not easily accommodate. The stone circles and alignments found across the Saharan region, at sites in Niger, in Chad, in Mali, in Mauritania, represent a tradition of megalithic construction that predates the dynastic Egyptian civilization and that shows consistent astronomical orientation and construction methodology across distances of thousands of kilometers. The existence of a consistent megalithic tradition across the full breadth of the Saharan region during the Green Sahara period implies a degree of communication and shared cultural practice that the standard narrative, which treats these cultures as isolated regional groups, does not account for. The Tartaria framework treats these megalithic sites as the above-ground remnants of the same civilization that built and managed the underground river systems. They are the ceremonial and administrative infrastructure of a hydraulic civilization that organized itself around the management of water, as all hydraulic civilizations do, and that left traces in the landscape both above and below the current surface. The timing matters here. The Green Sahara ended around 5,000 years ago. The beginning of the historical record in Egypt, in Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, is dated to approximately the same period, around 5,000 to 4,500 years ago. The civilizations that begin the historical record appear, in the standard account, to emerge relatively suddenly from predecessor cultures that were significantly less complex. The speed of this emergence from relatively simple agricultural societies to complex urban civilizations with sophisticated administrative, legal, and technological systems within a few centuries is one of the persistent puzzles of ancient history that the standard account has never fully resolved. The Tartaria framework resolves it by proposing that the civilizations of the historical period were not emergent but derived. They were the survivors of a more complex civilization destroyed by the same event that ended the Green Sahara. They retained, in fragmented and imperfectly understood form, the knowledge systems and organizational templates of their predecessor. The hydraulic knowledge that made Egypt and Mesopotamia possible was not invented by the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. It was inherited from the civilization that had managed the rivers beneath the Sahara. The event that ended the Green Sahara is itself a matter of scientific debate. The standard account attributes the drying of the Sahara to the gradual shift in orbital parameters that weakened the West African monsoon over several thousand years. But sediment core data from Lake Yoa in Chad and from marine sediment cores off the West African coast suggests that the transition was not gradual. It appears in the high-resolution sediment record to have been abrupt, completed within centuries rather than millennia, around 5,200 years ago. An abrupt transition of this kind is more consistent with a catastrophic forcing event than with the gradual orbital change proposed by the standard model. What kind of catastrophic forcing could have ended the Green Sahara abruptly? Candidates include major volcanic eruptions, impact events, and rapid ice sheet dynamics. None of these hypotheses has been definitively confirmed or ruled out by the available evidence. The mainstream scientific community treats the question of the Green Sahara's ending as an open one, though it maintains a preference for the orbital forcing explanation. The Tartaria framework treats the abrupt ending of the Green Sahara as part of the same reset event that destroyed or disrupted the predecessor civilization. A catastrophic event of sufficient scale to disrupt the West African monsoon system would have been a global event, affecting not only Africa but every region of the world. There are indicators of a major disruption in the global climate and human cultural record around 5,000 to 4,500 years ago. The 4.2 kiloyear event, a period of severe drought that affected civilizations from Egypt to the Indus Valley to China, is documented in the geological and archaeological record. Whether it was triggered by natural causes or by something else remains an open question the standard model has not fully closed. The Niger River, one of the major rivers of West Africa, provides a surface-level illustration of the kind of anomaly the Tartaria framework is built to explain. The Niger rises in the highlands of Guinea, flows northeast into the Sahara, makes a great inland bend through what is now Mali, and then turns sharply southeast to reach the Atlantic through the Niger Delta in Nigeria. This path makes no topographic sense. A river that rises near the Atlantic coast should flow toward the Atlantic coast. The Niger does not. It flows away from the coast into terrain that should block it, and then loops back. The Tartaria interpretation is that the river was redirected. Its northern inland bend reflects a channel system that was deliberately constructed to bring water into the interior of the Saharan region. And the current river course is the legacy of that construction modified by millennia of natural processes. Conventional geologists attribute the anomaly to tectonic capture events. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. The rivers beneath the Sahara are not moving. They are stone now, carved impressions in bedrock filled with sand and time. They are not going anywhere. But they were going somewhere. Once. West, against the logic of the landscape that came after them, across distances that imply an organizing intelligence that the standard model of prehistoric human capability does not accommodate. They moved water in quantities and across distances that suggest a continental scale project of water management. The question of who planned that project and what happened to them is not a question that the radar images alone can answer. The images show where the water went. They do not show who directed it, but the direction is evidence. A river that flows the wrong way has to have a reason. Either the landscape was different, which the mainstream account confirms, or someone made it flow that way, which the mainstream account does not consider, or both, which is the possibility that deserves the most careful attention. A landscape that was organized differently, managed deliberately by a civilization that no longer appears in any historical record, oriented to move water in directions that are now impossible, and then buried under 5,000 years of desert and silence, while the survivors of whatever ended it built new civilizations on top of the fragments of knowledge they had managed to preserve. This is what the Tartaria framework sees when it looks at the radar images of the Sahara. It sees the infrastructure of a world that existed before the world we know. It sees the rivers that were built or managed or directed by people who understood water in ways that we are only now beginning to recover. It sees, in the east to west flow of channels that run against every logic of the current landscape, the signature of intention. Someone decided that the water would go this way. Someone had the capacity to make it go this way. And then something happened that buried the rivers under sand and buried the people who built them under silence, and left us with a landscape that looks uninhabited and has always been inhabited, that looks natural and was once managed, that looks empty and is full of the traces of what was there before. The ground-penetrating radar will keep looking. The satellite imagery will keep refining. Researchers willing to ask the questions that the mainstream has set aside will keep following the channels into the dark beneath the sand. The rivers are there, they ran the wrong way, and they ran the wrong way for a reason 5,000 years of desert and sand have not been able to erase. If you have followed this far, you already understand that the history we are given is not the complete history. The radar looked through the surface of the Sahara and found a different world underneath. That is what this work is about. Looking through the surface of the accepted account and finding what has been buried there. Subscribe if you want to keep looking. The next video goes deeper on this question.